Welcome to the Cost of Everything podcast. You might not have been expecting an episode from me today. Well, I guess you never know when to expect an episode from me. But here we are, and I thought I would take the opportunity on Chinese New Year to share an episode I did a few years ago, but never had a chance to upload. So, now is the time, and Leonie McKeon, who has been extremely patient in waiting for the upload of this episode, 2 years is very patient indeed, is my special guest. She's an expert in the 36 strategies, an international author and keynote speaker, and is a Chinese educated strategist. We talked about the 36 strategies, what this means as a concept, and ways to understand how the Chinese think about business and negotiation. It's an absolute treat of an episode, so I hope you enjoy it. I've linked to Leonie's website and LinkedIn page in the description. So for now, let's get into the episode. So Leonie, thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to recording this episode with you and learning all about the 36 Chinese strategies. So first of all, thank you for joining me.
My absolute pleasure, Amrit Pal. It's really great to be here.
Great to have you. So I think getting started before we get into these 36 Chinese strategies, just a little bit about your background really and how you got into negotiating.
Sure. Many years ago, my friend and I left Australia to travel around the world, and we went off around the world with backpacks on. And we went across Europe and we went to the Middle East. We lived on a kibbutz for 6 months and we went to Egypt and Turkey. And I had no understanding of Chinese culture. And we ended up in Hong Kong looking for a job. That was my grand idea. And unfortunately, my idea really didn't come to fruition because we had just been in India and we really looked like we'd sort of ran out of money backpacking travellers and had been in India with our drawstring pants and our long hair. And we weren't really looking that employable. Anyway, we ran into someone who said, "What are you guys doing in Hong Kong?" It was a really cheap youth hostel. And I said, "Well, we're trying to find a job." And he said, "Why don't you go to Taiwan?" I said, "What's in Taiwan?" He said, "Well, I've been teaching English there and, you can earn some money and if you speak English, you'll get a job there." And so off we went to Taiwan. It's only an hour away on the plane and we had a bit of credit left on our visa cards. And so we landed in Taiwan and it took us a while to get started, with the English teaching circuit because we had to learn what to do and we went, we got some really amateur English teaching jobs and then gradually we went up the ladder and we had some fabulous English teaching jobs. And what happened was I stayed in Taiwan for a period of 5 years. So what was a journey to visit Taiwan and put some more money back in my pocket to continue traveling? I ended up staying there for 5 years. Realizing that Mandarin would be a great language to know, so I studied Mandarin while I was there, taught English as a second language, edited a series of children's books, and I also opened a small clothing business, bringing clothing from Kathmandu into Taiwan. We lived in Taipei for a year and then went down to Kaohsiung for the next 4 years. Now, Kaohsiung is, at that time it was anyway, very, very Chinese. So you really had to speak Chinese to be able to live there because all the signs were in Chinese, everything was in Chinese. The one thing during those 5 years that really came through is that Chinese people are really good at negotiating and negotiation was everywhere. I had one of those little 90cc motorbikes, a Vespa, and if you were changing your brakes or if you're changing a light or you had a flat tire, it was always, everything was negotiable. Your salary was negotiable, your rent was negotiable. And these people were really good at negotiating. This was the world they lived in. And that became, I suppose, really apparent to me, but unconsciously in a way. And on opening the small clothing business, bringing clothing from Nepal into Taiwan, we used to go out in the markets after teaching English at night, and we're actually the only two foreigners on the market selling clothes. And I realised that the negotiation was just going on there all the time. So it didn't really become apparent to me why Chinese people are really good at negotiating, but I knew that I was living in a culture that was negotiating all of the time.
So, I mean, it sounds like a real adventure you are on, and even up until the point where, you've been there for 5 years and you became an entrepreneur and you learned how good the Chinese were at negotiating. But so, how different was the experience of negotiation as you had in China compared with what you were used to in Australia?
I find in Australia, most things are very, the price is very fixed. And that's not to say that if you go into a supermarket in Taiwan or China, they have fixed prices, but a lot more things are negotiable. And in Australia, we don't get a lot of practice at negotiation because most people, they'll negotiate a couple of times, probably for a couple of things in their life, and that's generally for a house and a car. And, most of us don't buy houses, every week, and most of us don't buy cars every week. So they're the two things. And often people, when we were traveling more, maybe they'd go to Asia and they'd say, oh, we're going to the markets, and it's really quite daunting because people are negotiating everywhere and they want me to, and they'll put a really high price on something, and people were quite afraid to play the game of negotiation. So it's about the experience of negotiation and the practice at it, because the more that you practice something, the better off you are at it. So that's the difference I found. And also with negotiation in Chinese culture, it is everything. Negotiation encompasses a whole world, a whole way of thinking. Whereas in Australia, it encompasses one piece of the business. So negotiation may be a piece of the business where you sit around a boardroom table and you negotiate, and you may have that meeting from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock or whatever, and that's the negotiation. Whereas in Chinese culture, you are always negotiating. In fact, some of my clients say to me, Leonie, when do we start negotiating? And my answer is, when did you meet that Chinese person? Well, I met them at a business function and then we went out for dinner. I say that's when you started negotiating, because it's not all about money. It's not all about business. It's about building the relationship really strongly.
I'm really looking forward to getting into that as well, because you've got some really interesting thoughts on this, and definitely we need to get into that. And I think that whole idea of, it's for us in the West, it's an experience of negotiation, and it's that whole, it being one piece of the business, and you're trying to work on it as a specific thing rather than it being all encompassing in the whole encounter,
Yes.
is really fascinating. And I completely agree. When the only times I sort of in my personal life when I think about negotiating is, getting a bit off the price of a house when I go to buy a house, or thinking about how much I want to buy a car for. And it's amazing that nothing really falls into negotiation anywhere else. It does appear. I mean, is it the appearance that things are fixed price, or is it just it is fixed price and there's no point in negotiating on that? Just from your experience.
Well, I think that it's about the culture is so geared up for negotiation. Chinese culture, Asian culture is out on the street. Now, anybody that's been to China, been to Asia, Thailand, wherever, they will notice that there are markets, there are places outside. People are always bargaining for food, they're bargaining for clothes. You go to Hong Kong, there's a market there. Whereas in Australia, we don't have those. We might have the Sunday market, and I know in London you have some markets, but in Asian culture, especially in Chinese culture, they're everywhere. So the child of 5 years old is so used to going and walking through markets and bargaining for things. So by the time you get to 25, you've probably negotiated thousands of times and you're really good at it. Now, what difference is it negotiating for the shirt or the kilo of apples compared to the business deal? It takes the same skills. You've got more invested in the business deal. However, you've had a lot of practice along the way.
Yeah, we do. We definitely have markets here, and I know my family used to work on the markets here in the country as well. And there's definitely an art to it as well as a skill and understanding of the language in between the words. So just taking a step back again, and so obviously you're not in China anymore.
Mhm.
So what was the intervening period then from where we left off?
Sure. Okay. So I left Taiwan having decided to come back to Australia. Now, all of my experience in Taiwan was without a university degree. So I'm fluent in Mandarin. I've got lots of knowledge about Chinese culture and negotiation. However, I have no academic qualification the whole time I was in Taiwan. So that's a great thing because you become like a sponge because you've got no real structure, you've got no judgment. However, you have no critical analysis of things. So I was a bit tired of being a sponge because I wanted to learn why things are the way they are. Prior to that, I went to China. Was going to China for 3 months because I thought, well, I've been living in Taiwan. I'll go to China. I have the language. I ended up staying a year in China. So I backpacked around China for a year. And I went to all the provinces. I learned, all about the different cultures, the different philosophies, the difference in accents between the cultures. Came back to Australia, and then I started my academic journey. And I began my journey with my first degree, which is in anthropology. So my bachelor degree is in anthropology from the University of Adelaide. And then I studied a postgraduate degree in business. So I have a degree in anthropology and a degree in business. And in 1998, I opened my first business, which provided cultural awareness training. I designed a language course, translations, interpretations, and I ended up having 8 Chinese staff. We were doing a lot of translations of documents for wine companies and lots of different government jobs, interpretations when delegations would come into South Australia. I was right in the mining boom in Western Australia, so we were doing a lot of work across the country. What happened though? It was in the year 2000, and I was at one of my regular trips to Shanghai, and I met someone at a networking function, and he said to me, Leonie, would you like to go for a coffee? And I said, fantastic. Now, this man had lived in China for 10 years. So this is in the year 2000. He was very fluent in Mandarin. He was an Australian man. So we went out for coffee, and the only coffee shop at that time was Starbucks. And so we're sitting in the Starbucks coffee shop, and to this day, I haven't obviously been to China for a while, but when I was going to China, I still look at that coffee shop and I say that is where my life changed about China. That is where it changed, because he said to me, Leonie, have you heard of the 36 Chinese strategies? And I said, you mean the strategies that are derived from Sun Tzu's The Art of War? And he said, yes. And I said, well, I've read The Art of War, and it's a text of 2,500 years. It's 2,500 years old. How does that have any bearing on the contemporary business world? And he said to me, and he looked out the window and he said, that is how this culture thinks. These strategies are fundamental in the culture. Every Chinese person knows them, whether they use them unconsciously or consciously. You need to know these upside down, back, the front, and sideways if you want to be a Chinese expert. And I say these strategies are not just for China, they're for Taiwan, they're for any Hong Kong, they're for any Chinese person in Australia. They will know the 36 Chinese strategies. So I'm on the aeroplane and I thought, okay, well, I've got staff. So I came into the office on the Monday morning and I said to my staff, have you heard of the 36 Chinese strategies? And they looked at me, and it's like saying to an Australian person, have you heard of a kangaroo? Have you heard of a koala bear? I don't know the equivalent in England, but it was so, they looked at me as if to say, yes, and haven't you? And I knew then that they were so fundamental. Every Chinese person knows them and understands them. Now, back to the question about why the culture is so competent and understands negotiation and negotiates all the time. In my opinion, there are three things. The first one is that the culture is very out in the street as far as markets go. So children understand markets from a very young age. The second thing is most people live in high rise in the cities. So children do not have the space to play sports like football, basketball, these kinds of sports. So what they do is they obviously only have their apartment to play games in, but they are brought up on games of strategy. There is a game called Go. The translation is Huiqi, and chess. These games, backgammon, so mahjong. So children all Chinese children, well, that's a generalization, but most Chinese children can play chess very well. They can play these games of strategy. So already we have a culture that has walked through markets, understood bargaining, and they're brought up in games of strategy. And they have a concept in their culture called the 36 Chinese strategies. So it is no wonder that these people are good at negotiation.
That's really interesting. I think that aspect is really fascinating. The fact that it's games that children grow up with. What you were saying, I think from my perspective, is sort of like, fish and chips, really, isn't it? So
Yeah, that's from your perspective. Yes, that's what it would be.
Exactly. And the art of war is so famous in terms of a text.
Yes.
I think I've tried reading it, and I tend to read interpretations instead,
Yes.
because trying to interpret it myself, I think, of course, you need to probably spend time in trying to interpret it and understand it from your own perspective and your own experiences. But I find the interpretations seem a lot more straightforward to understand than actually the text itself. But like I said, the art of war, it's so synonymous with China. The sort of understanding that it's part of their culture, I think, is a real eye opener, and the fact that it's part of who they are without being conscious necessarily. So we've talked a little bit that the 36 strategies, Chinese strategies, are derived from that. So if you can sum up quite quickly, I guess, or quite, if you could provide a short summary of what the 36 Chinese strategies actually are.
Sure. 36 strategies are like idioms. They're like idioms. So, for example, don't cry over spilt milk. Now, we all know what that means. However, it doesn't mean that someone is standing there crying and the milk is spilling. It has another meaning. We know the code inside it. So the strategies are like idioms. Fool the emperor to cross the sea. Wait leisurely for an exhausted enemy. Make a noise in the east and attack in the west. Now, they sound like warlike strategies, and in a sense they are, because they were written 2,500 years ago. However, each of these strategies has a contemporary business application. So the strategies are very similar to idioms. Well, we could say they're actually idioms. They're sayings, they're ways into the culture. The strategies have often been described as the core of understanding Chinese culture. A quick example, just for our listeners to understand what the strategies are a little bit more, is, for example, strategy 3, murder with a borrowed knife. Now, it doesn't mean someone is there murdering someone with a borrowed knife. What it's talking about is the hierarchical culture of Chinese culture, the hierarchy inside Chinese culture. So that means that if you're dealing with a Chinese group, the person who is the highest status will be the person who says the least. Unlike Western culture, this is the difference. The person who of the highest status, we actually know who they are because they dress the best, they might say the most. It's the person that's just beneath that person in hierarchy that will answer the difficult questions, answer the proposals. It will not be that head person. Now, where this gets complicated for Western people, and I've been with helped many businesses through this, is that we try to contact the head person if there's a problem with a factory, or if there's a problem, with something that they're making, or they want to sort something out. I'll contact the head person, but it doesn't work that way. You need to contact the person that's just below that person, and then you'll get what you want done. It's similar to the king on the chessboard. That's murder with a borrowed knife, because the king on the chessboard is the piece that moves the least. However, the king on the chessboard is the most powerful piece on the board, because the king on the chessboard gets all the other pieces to do the work. So when you're dealing with Chinese culture, strategy 3, murder with a borrowed knife, look for the king on the chessboard, and that's the one that you don't deal with. That's the person who moves the least and says the least.
It also ties in quite nicely with the fact that the Chinese are so sort of cultured around chess, around those strategy type games as well. So what made you think or how did you go about developing sort of these modern equivalent idioms then to these ancient strategies?
Okay, so this was in the year 2000. All right, what I did was I spent a year talking to Chinese people. Okay, what does strategy 1 mean? What does it mean to you? Have you had that applied on you? Can you explain it to me in your own words? I spent a year decoding these. And then once I'd got a grip on it, because what I realized was there was the art of war, but there was nothing in between. There was nothing to really help people understand how these strategies are used in the modern business world. Just the art of war is about emperors and horses running through rivers and bows and arrows. How do you apply that to the contemporary business world? So that was my journey. And then I started delivering workshops on this. And then, of course, my consultancies, all of my work revolves around this. And, it might be that a company presents me with a business case, and I will look at the strategies then that we need to use, to get the best result with that business case. So that's what I started doing. And then, of course, I moved. What happened was people started asking me, or managers of events started asking me, would you speak at a mining conference? Because mining was a very big thing in those days. Yes, okay. And what I'd do is I'd present 3 strategies in a mining conference at a keynote. And I would then send the work that came off that back to my staff. It might be translations, interpretation. So I was the one in the business that was doing the 36 Chinese strategies. And so then I moved into the conference speaking circuit. So I'm also a professional conference speaker. In 2013, I sold my business that I had developed with my 8 Chinese staff. I sold it to my 2 senior staff, which was an absolute seamless sale. 2 lovely young men from Shanghai. They're Australian citizens and they've got young families, and they bought my business, and they've never really looked back. And it was great. So now I'm me, Leonie McKeon. I'm a one person business, bringing people in if I need to, but it's me because I'm the specialist. And so then people were asking me, Leonie, what about a book? What about a book? And, I'm at conferences, and a lot of the conference speakers have got books and people are signing their books. We need a book. We need a book. And so in 2017, that was my journey of writing books. So I became, the author of books. So I've now written 6 books because the strategies are arranged in groups of 6. So, for example, the first 6 are the advantageous strategies. Then we've got the confusion strategies, the opportunistic strategies, and so on and so on. So each one of my books has 6 strategies. I've located the original story, and I've interpreted it so that people actually understand it. the first two parts of the book are examples of how the strategy is used on you. Then I've got the guarding against, how you guard yourself against it, how you use it on Chinese people, and the other chapter in the book is if we take China right out of the picture, it's about how you use it in a Western environment, because a lot of people have read The Art of War. They don't have to be dealing with Chinese business culture, but they want to know how to use the strategies in their everyday life, in their business. So I completed my books at the end of 2020, and I now have 6 books. They've been picked up by the largest publishing company in Indonesia, and they're now all translated into Indonesian. So they're becoming very popular. When I speak now, at functions or whatever, I always take my books, people buy them, they're on Amazon. So that's how I started. So I researched with the strategies, and each company that I work with always, it gives me so much information, because it might be, I've worked for furniture companies, I've worked for fashion companies, I've worked for wine companies, investment companies. All of these companies, I'm constantly using the strategy. So that's sort of where I'm up to at the moment.
I mean, I've tried to read things like sort of Machiavelli, The Prince, and trying to read The Art of War, and then trying to bring it into a sort of modern context. I've always found the interpretations almost more valuable, sort of more valuable than just trying to read the original text. So I think it's sort of vital to have these interpretations within the modern context, because it's ever evolving as well. So I guess that the listeners are in all about cost as well, and trying to understand sort of how cost is linked in with negotiating as well. So I guess, could you then give that context of how cost is perceived in a negotiation?
Sure. Now, with the strategies, there's 36 of them, all right, and they're very much about maneuvering, understanding who you're dealing with, really doing your research. Cost, especially in the beginning, isn't really as important as the relationship, because especially in Chinese culture, when you develop the relationship really strongly, it's almost like the cost is I won't say it's irrelevant, but it is not as important. I'll give you an example of how cost works. Okay, let's say, for example, I'm a real estate agent, all right, and I have a Chinese family that wants to buy a house here in South Australia, because that's where I am. And the house is very expensive, all right? But what I'm going to do, I'm going to apply make a noise in the east and attack in the west. So what I'm going to do is make sure that the house that I've chosen for them has all of the things that they want. For example, they might want to be near a shopping centre. They might want to be near an aged care facility because they've got aging parents, a school, whatever. And what I do is make a noise in the east and attack in the west. Strategy 6 means that you don't focus on the cost, you focus on the things that are important. So by the time I have outlined all of these things that are important, my Chinese customer will not worry about the cost, because I've covered everything that they need. I've covered everything that they need, so that then they don't have to think, well, I have to go and find another house that's near a shopping centre or whatever. So that's a strategy 6, make a noise in the east and attack in the west. That's how you would use it, focusing on the things that are important. And then once you get to the cost, it's quite irrelevant.
So in sort of a slightly different context then, I mean, I like the idea of cost is not as important as the relationship, because I think what I've seen in this country in particular is that construction contracts, for example, have gone away from this more, I guess, adversarial sort of adversarial relationship, or this the whole thing has been, if you're a client and you want to get something, don't just try and go for the lowest bidder.
Mm-hmm.
And because that doesn't actually end up being a true reflection of what happens in that contract. Cost overruns start happening. So actually what's more important, and a lot of focus in modern contracts, is on alliances, sort of close contact, close relationship, and having trust in that relationship. So it really does sort of lend to that kind of idea of that the relationship is important firstly.
The
But
relationship is vital.
yeah, absolutely. And the other side that I wanted to sort of question on was how sort of if my agenda is to try and get something for a lower cost from a supplier, how would you go about sort of using the strategy? What would be the focus then?
Well, the focus would be that if you're visiting, and that doesn't have to be visiting China, it could be visiting a client somewhere else. That I would be very wary of telling them when you're leaving, because if you do that, for example, if I'm going to see a Chinese client and we know that we're going to be talking about cost because we've come up to that point, and they say to me, "Oh, when are you leaving? This place?" And if it was Thursday, I was arriving, and I said, "Well, I'm leaving. I'm leaving next Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock." On Monday night, I will be exhausted because I've given them the links in to when I will be leaving. So it's almost like you have to be slightly vague about the times that you're leaving that meeting. And it gets into location as well. It depends if you're if you're going to be talking about price on your own location or their location. So there's lots of variables here, but the most important thing is to develop the relationship really strongly. And then cost is always relevant. However, for example, if I've got, three wine companies or three companies that have, let's say, wool in Australia, one is the most expensive and the other two are cheaper, and maybe they might be just as good. However, the company that I have the best relationship with, if I'm a Chinese buyer, would be, I would probably take the one that I have the best relationship with, because that will provide me with the solidity, to be able to ask difficult questions about cost, about delivery date, because once you have that trust, then you can ask those more difficult questions.
I think there's a lot to these 36 strategies that we just don't have the time to cover, probably even one, to be honest. And, I think cost is always a part of negotiating because it's the crux of what you are negotiating on.
Yes.
You want something, but you have an idea of how much you want to pay for it. And that's where the negotiation comes in. So I think it intertwines quite nicely. But what I'd like to talk about next is actually that you have a training program around the 36 Chinese strategies, and in a way it can probably help a lot of people in the cost arena to become better at negotiating. So can we sort of discuss a bit more about this training program?
For sure. Well, I have a workshop which is actually a whole day, and it's covering all of the 36 strategies. It generally goes from 8 to 4:30. However, it can be in 2 half days if people want it. It can be online. I deliver it online. So if a company says, okay, we want 10 people trained, or 15 people trained on the strategies, I can do 2 half days online. Generally online I do 2 half days because I find that a whole day is a little bit too much online for people. Face to face, that's a whole day. I also consult one-to-one. So some people might have an hour with me a week, depending on their situation. And at that point, I take them through 4 strategies, and that's generally a 9-hour program. It could be a 10-hour program because we do some review. So anything really that people want. I have workbooks that I can send them, when people sign up for this. So it's really tailored for the needs of the organisation or the needs of the person. It could be 3 people, it could be 4, it could be 1, it could be an hour a week, it could be 2 half days, it could be a full day. I can really design it however people want it. But what I do is take people through each of the strategies. So they have a workbook which they work through. They learn how the strategy is applied on them. So we have a case study. This is what will happen when you go to a meeting. How do you guard yourself against it? They also learn how to use the strategy themselves in a Chinese context. And they can also learn how to use the strategy in a Western context. And it's important for our listeners to understand that if they wanted to learn the strategies purely in a Western context, I do that all of the time. We can take Chinese culture right out of the picture. What is your business? I look at the business case, and then people can, provide me with the information, and then we can, go through the strategies or apply the strategies on whatever the situation.
I think it's great that it can be delivered online, and also that it's bespoke. It's not just a generic course. It's tailor-made for the needs of a specific person. It's fantastic, or a specific need. So I've really appreciated everything that we've talked about today. It's a really eye-opening part of a negotiation, just that cultural understanding. And you've got a wider experience there as well. You've got the Western lens, you've got the Chinese lens, you've also got, to some extent, the Southeast Asian lens, where you've got Nepal and India in there as well, which I think is, again, a slightly different cultural sort of perspective. I guess one question that I'm just going to throw in there, and I've not given you any time to prepare for this, but I guess, shoot from the hip. So just generally, as within the Western context, whether be that a negotiation with the Chinese or negotiation with another person, how do you think people can get better at negotiating?
Practice is important. I find that when people learn the strategies, then they think about them. So once they know the 36 of them, then, and one of the pieces of work that I give people, homework you could say, is, okay, I want you to pick 3 of the 36 strategies, and how are they, when you go outside or you listen to the radio or you listen to the news or you read the newspaper, how do they actually, can you see these strategies in action? So it's not necessarily even having, a negotiation to practice, because once you learn the strategies, it's a way of thinking, and you think about them all the time, and that's how you build on it. You build then on with your own examples. It's kind of like learning how to draw, but you're not going to just be drawing the thing that the teacher tells you. You'll be drawing other things because you've learned how to draw, if that makes sense.
There is an artistic saying for this, and I always forget what it is, but it's sort of related to helping a picture to emerge from the background.
Yes.
So if you didn't have that help, it would basically mean that everything we would see would be a fog.
Yes.
So we had no way of interpreting it, and I think it's called figure ground. I think that's what it's called, the artistic concept. So really, definitely I agree with that. So I guess all that's left to say then is thank you for joining me today, Leonie. It's been great talking to you.
My absolute pleasure. And if any of your listeners want to contact me, I know that you're putting links on and things like this, but Amrit Pal, they can always, we can always organise a Zoom, 30 minutes on Zoom or whatever. Tell me about your business. Tell me about your situation. There's no obligation to take, to have work with me, but if they'd just like to have a chat about if they want to go on from there, fine. If they don't, that's okay. But I'm very happy to do that.
Many thanks to Leonie for the insightful discussion, and it really does show that there is so much about culture that we have yet to learn about, and how it influences our approach to situations. Around cost, this is massive. Our perspective on the estimate and what the price of something is, and the value we derive from it. Okay, so next episode will be an interstitial one before we get into the new season. That should be up before the end of January. I do like to keep you guessing though. For now, thank you for listening and have a great week.